When me and my trouble-making friends were 13, one of the many rowdy, reckless things we'd get up to on Saturday nights was ding-dong ditch runs. This was about 10 years ago, back when we all lived on the same block in a typical suburban neighborhood. But at that time, there were fewer houses and way more woods creeping around the edges of the streets. For this story, I'll make up some names for my friends. There was Mark, James, and Matt. Mark and James were always the bold ones, the ones who would actually creep up to the porches and press the doorbells. Matt and I, on the other hand, would always scatter and find hiding spots the second they moved toward a house, crouching behind bushes or ducking behind fences, trying not to laugh too loudly while we waited for the reactions. That night, we hit about 5 or 6 houses in a row. I still remember how almost every man who opened the door reacted the exact same way, stepping out onto the stoop with a confused or annoyed look, squinting into the dark, maybe muttering something under their breath. 1 or 2 of them would actually shout out into the night, their voices sharp and echoing against the stillness, before shaking their heads and going back inside, letting the door slam behind them. For a couple of those houses, we decided to ring the bell a second time, hoping to get a bigger reaction. The tension of waiting in the dark, listening for footsteps and the door creaking open again, always made my heart hammer against my ribs. I remember one guy who really lost it. The second time we rang, he flung the door open and shouted into the yard that he was calling the cops. The second he slammed the door, we all exchanged wide-eyed looks, and without saying a word, we bolted down the street, sneakers pounding on the pavement, breath misting in the cool night air, as we cut around the corner and fled to the next block over, adrenaline rushing through every part of us. Like I mentioned, 10 years ago, this neighborhood still had patches of woods scattered between empty lots where houses now stand. On the next block over, there were a few of those dark, overgrown patches of woods hugging some of the older houses, and the homes on this block seemed even more unkempt, like they hadn't felt alive in years. The first house on the block was right across the street from a thick patch of woods, which made it the perfect hiding spot for us. The house itself looked tired and worn down, with tall grass swallowing the front yard, and a ratty old car slumped in the driveway under a faded, torn cover that flapped gently in the breeze. It was a small, lonely-looking house, the kind you'd pass by without a second glance. Mark was the one who went up to ring the bell. He barely had time to sprint back across the street, slipping behind a tree before the door swung open. Another man stood there, but this guy was different. He was huge, easily 6 feet tall, with a thick, stocky build that made him look even more intimidating under the porch light. Unlike the others we'd messed with earlier, this guy didn't waste a second before letting his anger explode. He stormed down his steps and started pacing around his yard, shoving bushes aside, scanning the shadows, and yelling out threats into the night that were loud enough to make the hairs on my neck stand up. We couldn't help but laugh quietly from our hiding spot, the way we always did, muffling ourselves with our hands so we wouldn't give away our position. Eventually, after a few minutes of ranting and stomping around, the man grumbled and retreated back inside, slamming the door behind him. Mark waited a few moments, checking the windows, eyes darting back and forth, and then he sprinted back up the stoop to ring the bell again. I didn't envy him for it, not with this house. There was no way I would have been bold enough to press that man's doorbell a second time. Mark knew he wouldn't have as much time this round, so the moment he rang, he didn't bother running back across the street. Instead, he darted around to the side of the house, vanishing into the shadows. The door burst open much faster this time, and when it did, the man stepped out, and he was holding a rifle in his hand. The three of us, me, Matt, and James, froze, exchanging panicked looks as the reality of what we'd done hit us all at once. It felt like time stopped, like we were about to be dragged out of the darkness and put under arrest right there. The man started checking all the places he'd checked before, moving with heavy, determined steps across his lawn. But this time he was even more thorough. He checked behind his car, peered around the edges of the porch, and circled around a couple of trees, his head swiveling as he scanned the dark. Then he stepped to the center of his lawn, gripping the rifle, and just stood there, like he was listening, thinking, waiting. His head slowly turned, and then it stopped, facing directly toward the woods where we were hiding. My breath caught in my throat as his gaze seemed to slice through the darkness, straight at us. Me, Matt, and James glanced at each other, our eyes wide with the same terrified thought, and we slowly ducked lower into the underbrush, praying that he hadn't really seen us. After about 10 long, suffocating seconds of him staring directly into the patch of woods where we were hiding, the man finally turned and went back inside his house. We all let out a shaky breath we hadn't realized we'd been holding, but before we could even begin to feel safe, we saw him again, this time at his front window, standing there like a statue, rigid and unmoving, his dark silhouette outlined in the glow from inside, still watching the woods. It felt like his eyes were drilling through the branches and undergrowth, straight into where we crouched, our knees pressed into the cold dirt, hearts pounding so hard it almost hurt. Then, through the darkness, we noticed Mark creeping back toward the man's front door, moving like a shadow, trying to be quick and quiet. There was nothing we could do. We were frozen, too afraid to move, too terrified to whisper a single word to stop him. Mark rang the doorbell again. And then he ran. But the man didn't move, not right away. He just stood there at the window, unmoving, like he was processing what had just happened, or maybe like he was letting the moment sink in before reacting. Then, after a minute that felt like it stretched out forever, the man turned and disappeared from the window, melting back into the darkness of his house. We didn't see Mark again after that. We couldn't even speak. Every small sound around us, the rustling of leaves, the distant hum of a streetlight, felt like it might give us away. We just stayed hidden, tense, waiting, not daring to move. The next thing I remember was Mark's voice, sharp and urgent, cutting through the cold night air from across the street. "Run!" We didn't understand why he was yelling until we heard it. The sound of someone crashing through the brush behind us, heavy boots pounding on the ground, getting closer. We turned our heads, and in the dim glow from a nearby porch light, we saw him. The man from across the street, charging at us with his rifle in hand, pointed directly at us. That was the moment the fear turned to full-blown panic. We bolted, running like prey from a predator, stumbling over roots and branches, not daring to look back as we sprinted toward Mark, who was waiting across the street, waving frantically. We didn't stop. We ran for blocks, our legs burning, our breath tearing at our lungs, until we were sure we had lost him, until the darkness swallowed up the threat behind us. When we finally stopped, Mark explained in between heavy breaths that he had yelled when he saw the man sneaking across the street with his gun, slipping into the patch of woods to ambush us. We never reported him. We never told any adults about what happened that night. We just told a few friends, letting it become one of those stories that lived quietly between us. Luckily, the house was many blocks away from where we lived, so we never really had to pass it again. I lived in what felt like a house from hell for a couple of weeks. At the time, I was a college student, and my parents were covering the rent so I could live somewhere decent while I focused on my classes. Yeah, I know, unspoiled, lucky me. The house itself was nothing special, just a modest, quiet place on a quiet street. It wasn't big, it wasn't fancy, but I was happy with it. Well, for the first few days anyway. Then things started getting strange, fast. It was a rainy Saturday, the sky a dull gray that pressed against the windows, water streaking down the glass in steady lines. I had nothing to do, nowhere to be, so I sank into the couch and spent a few hours watching TV, letting the sounds of the storm outside drown out everything else. That's when I heard it. A scraping sound on the living room floor. I turned my head sharply, scanning the room, half expecting to see a raccoon or something that had found its way inside. The sound was quick, almost like something dragging for just a moment before stopping. But there was nothing there, just the flicker of the TV reflected on the coffee table and the steady drip of rain outside. I sat back down, telling myself it was nothing, that maybe the house was just settling or the wind was rattling something outside. That was the first weird thing that happened. The rain didn't let up for the rest of the day. It poured into the night, a constant hush against the house, which felt like an excuse not to go out, not to meet up with anyone, not to leave the safety of the living room. So I stayed, the glow of the TV keeping me company as shadows danced along the walls, shifting with the light. I don't know what made me perk up, but at some point I thought I heard something coming from the kitchen. A small sound, barely there, but sharp enough to break the bubble of comfort I had wrapped around myself. Laughably, I grabbed a pillow from the couch as if it could protect me, clutching it to my chest like a flimsy shield as I slowly walked toward the kitchen doorway. The hallway felt longer than usual, every creak of the floorboards under my feet echoing in the silence as I approached. And there, in the middle of the dark kitchen, was a box of Cheerios lying on its side, hundreds of tiny O's scattered across the floor in a chaotic, crunchy mess. I just stood there for a moment, blinking, trying to piece together how that could have happened. The box had been up on the counter earlier, I was sure of it. There was no reason for it to be on the floor, spilling itself everywhere like that. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding, feeling a tightness in my chest that I tried to ignore. Then I dropped the pillow onto the floor and knelt down, quietly picking up the Cheerios one by one, the storm still whispering against the windows as I cleaned up the mess in that too quiet kitchen. As I was scooping up the scattered Cheerios, dropping them one by one into the box, I heard it, a creak, sharp and quick, like the sound a weak spot in a wooden floor makes when someone steps on it. The sound came from near the kitchen table. I froze, the handful of Cheerios clutched in my palm, and lifted my eyes slowly toward the table. But there was nothing there. The chairs were still, the shadows were still, and the only movement was the rain sliding down the window. I swallowed, forcing down the tightness in my throat, telling myself I was just going crazy, that every little sound was messing with my head, making me jump at shadows. I finished cleaning up the Cheerios in silence, dumping the last handful into the trash, and went back to the living room, sinking into the couch with the TV droning on in front of me. Outside, the thunder was getting louder, rolling and cracking as the storm moved closer, the bulk of it passing overhead with deep, heavy rumbles that shook the windows. Yet, strangely enough, I found it comforting. The rain, the thunder, the sound of the storm drumming against the roof and windows. It felt like a blanket, a steady, natural sound that wrapped around me, making the house feel a little less empty. That was the last thing I remember appreciating before I drifted off, slipping into what felt like an hour-long doze on the couch, the glow of the TV flickering across the room while the storm continued its song outside. But it wasn't the TV that woke me. I remember jolting awake, the last threads of sleep clinging to me as I sat up, my heart already racing. I was sure I had heard something, a bang or a thud from somewhere downstairs, something heavy enough to jar me awake. I sat there for a moment, staring into the shadows, waiting to hear it again. But the house was quiet, except for the low hum of the TV and the distant roll of thunder. Finally, I stood up, turned off the TV, and marched upstairs to bed, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that was clinging to me as I closed my bedroom door. The next day was normal. So was the day after that. Nothing strange, nothing out of place. The house was quiet again, and I began to tell myself that maybe it really was just my nerves getting the best of me, that maybe I needed to relax, to stop letting every creak and crack of this old house turn into a ghost in my head. But then it happened again. It was another gray, rainy day when the strange things started happening once more. I woke up that morning, staring up at the ceiling, feeling like I had been out drinking all night, like I had downed an entire bottle by myself. But I hadn't had a single drink. The heaviness in my head was worse than any hangover I'd ever had, pounding behind my eyes, making me feel sick and dizzy every time I tried to sit up. I didn't do much walking around that day. The gloomy, dark weather outside only made it easier to stay in bed, the rain making patterns on the glass as I lay there under the covers, my body aching with exhaustion I couldn't shake. I left the TV in my bedroom on, letting it play all day just to have some background noise in the silence. The voices and sounds a weak comfort against the oppressive quiet of the house. Next to my bed, I kept a garbage pail within arm's reach, just in case the nausea creeping up my throat won the battle and I needed to throw up. Around midday, I muted the TV when I heard something. It was coming from above me, from the attic. The attic door was actually in my bedroom, and most of the attic stretched right over that room, a low, looming space above my head every night while I slept. I tried to brush it off at first, telling myself it was just the house shifting, but it wasn't just once. I heard it 3, maybe 4 times. Small sounds, like something moving across the attic floor, just above where I lay. Every part of me was screaming to ignore it, but I couldn't. I managed to pull myself out of bed, even though every time I moved, the sickness in my stomach churned like it was going to rip me apart from the inside. My head pounded with every step, and the room seemed to tilt, but I clenched my teeth and forced myself to stand. I pulled the string on the attic door, watching it creak open, the folding steps dropping down with a dull thud onto the bedroom floor. I grabbed one of my old baseball bats, clutching it tightly, and climbed the steps, each one creaking under my weight, the sound echoing through the bedroom like a warning. I pulled the light switch down, and the attic lit up in a harsh yellow glow, chasing away the shadows for a moment. The light flickered once before holding steady, illuminating the dusty space. There were a few old boxes scattered around, their cardboard edges sagging, probably left by the previous owner, forgotten and gathering layers of dust. I looked around, my breath tight, scanning every corner. Nothing. No movement, no sign of anything living that could have made those sounds. Just the boxes, a few cobwebs shifting slightly in the draft, and the hum of the light bulb overhead. My grip tightened on the bat as I swallowed hard, my eyes darting around one last time before I backed down the steps, my feet hitting the floor of my bedroom with relief I didn't want to admit. I didn't like that attic. There was something about it that felt wrong. Something about the way the air seemed heavier up there. The way the shadows clung to the corners, no matter how bright the light was. The house stayed quiet for the rest of the day. Until that night. I woke up to what I first thought was thunder, the low rumble echoing somewhere in the distance as I blinked into the darkness of my room, my head still heavy, the sickness lingering in my stomach like a knot that wouldn't untangle. Then I heard it, a thud coming from above me, from the attic. The familiar sound made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end, sending chills down my spine as I lay there, listening, hoping it would stop. It didn't. I sat up slowly, swallowing against the nausea as I pulled the string on the attic door again, the steps folding down in front of me. I grabbed my baseball bat once more, gripping it so hard my knuckles turned white, and climbed up the steps, the air feeling colder with each step upward. At the top, I stopped, forcing myself to take a breath, letting the fear twist into something else, something sharper, something angry. I pulled the light switch, flooding the attic with that same harsh glow, and I raised my voice, letting out a scream in the most intimidating tone I could muster. My voice cracking, but loud, echoing through the attic as I stood there, bat raised, staring into the dusty, silent space. But before I could pull the light switch, standing there in the pitch-black attic with nothing but the sound of my own shaky breathing, I heard it. A child giggling. Soft, quick, and out of place. The sound of laughter in a space that should have been empty, echoing through the darkness around me like a needle scraping against glass. There are no words strong enough to capture what I felt in that moment. It was like every ounce of blood drained from my body in an instant, leaving me weightless, hollow, like my insides dropped straight to the floor while the rest of me stood frozen. Fear isn't even the right word. Fear is too soft, too small for what that moment felt like. It was a terror so deep it wrapped around my bones, squeezed the air out of my lungs, and left me with only the pounding of my heart in my ears. And then I was gone. I don't even remember running. One moment I was in that attic, frozen in place, and the next I was outside, standing in the cold rain, the drops soaking through my clothes, clinging to my skin as I pulled out my phone with trembling hands. I called my dad. I don't even remember what I said, only that I was begging him to come get me out of there, my voice cracking as I tried to explain, words tumbling out of me in a mess while I stood shivering in the rain. When my parents arrived, I saw the way they looked at me, saw the worry in their eyes, and in some strange way, I think they believed me. They saw how shaken I was, how the fear hadn't left me, how it clung to me like the rain soaking through my clothes. The next day, I packed up all of my things, with my parents there beside me, helping me carry boxes out of that house, the air inside heavy, like it was pressing down on me until I stepped outside. And I moved back home. To this day, I'm convinced that what I experienced in that house wasn't something I imagined, wasn't something that could be explained away by creaking wood or old pipes. What I felt, what I heard in that dark attic, it was real. And I will always believe that what I encountered in that house was completely, undeniably paranormal. I used to work as a maid for an old lady for a couple of weeks when I was 20. She had a really big yet old house, one of those places that could have been beautiful if someone had truly cared for it. She had, in her way, taken care of it, but it still felt like the house was slowly being swallowed by time. It sat on 2 acres of land, surrounded on 3 sides by thick woods that seemed to press in closer every day, with a quiet road on the other side. The house itself was ancient, mostly made of dark, weathered wood that groaned and shifted with every breeze. Inside, it was even darker. The shadows clung to every corner, making it feel like the sun never fully reached into that house, no matter the time of day. She would often keep the blinds shut in certain rooms for reasons I never understood. Sometimes, trying to make the place feel less like a cave, I would open the blinds just to let in a little sunlight. But every time I walked back into those rooms, I'd find the blinds shut tight again, as if the house itself rejected the light. Some rooms she kept lit only by candles, the flickering flames casting shadows on the walls, making the place feel even older, almost prehistoric, like stepping into a different time when I crossed the threshold. To top it off, the wood floors were a creaky ecosystem of their own, groaning underfoot with every step, no matter where you were in the house, the sound echoing in the stillness like whispers in the dark. The woman's name was Mel. She was around 70, with a sharpness in her eyes that made it clear she hadn't softened much with age. The kind of work Mel had me doing was mostly physical stuff she couldn't manage anymore, sweeping the floors that seemed to gather dust no matter how often I cleaned them, dusting the shelves lined with old photographs and books, washing dishes in the dim light of the kitchen, doing laundry that smelled faintly of cedar and dust, sorting mail into neat piles on the counter, and other small tasks like that. It was simple work, but in that dark, creaking house, surrounded by the pressing silence of the woods outside, even the simplest tasks felt heavy, like the shadows were always just a step behind me, watching as I moved through that old house. One weekend, Mel asked me to sleep there for a night or two. The house had 4 bedrooms, even though she lived there alone, so it wasn't an issue for her to offer me a room. Looking back, it's strange how easily I agreed. But at the time, it felt like nothing more than a favor, another part of the job. This part of the story takes place over a Friday, and technically, a Saturday as well. I arrived on Friday, just like I always did, exchanging only a few words with Mel, who never seemed interested in small talk. I dropped my backpack, stuffed with my clothes and cosmetics, onto the bed in the room where I'd be sleeping. The room smelled like wood and something older, something faint and musty that clung to the air no matter how much I opened the window. As I turned toward the door, I stopped. Mel was standing there in the doorway. She had this way about her, a stillness that made you feel like you had to be careful, like you couldn't move too quickly or too loudly around her. This entrance was no exception. She didn't say hello, which I suppose wasn't as weird as it sounds, considering how quiet she usually was. Instead, she just stood there for a moment, her eyes fixed on me. And then she told me, in that flat, unblinking way she had, to clean the bedroom right away. After that, she gave me simple instructions: straighten up the whole house. Then, without another word, she turned and went upstairs. I didn't see her for the rest of the day. The house felt even emptier without her silent presence downstairs, but every now and then I'd hear her footsteps above me. She seemed to walk back and forth in her bedroom, the creaks of the floor following her slow pacing, while I moved from room to room, cleaning in the heavy silence. It was unsettling, the way she moved without any other sounds up there. No murmuring of a TV, no quiet radio, nothing but her footsteps shifting from one end of the room to the other, back and forth, over and over. There were no TVs in this house, so I couldn't even imagine what she was doing up there all day, pacing in silence while the rest of the house held its breath. One thing that struck me as bizarre, even among all the odd things in that house, was how protective Mel was of her basement. She made it perfectly clear, in a tone that left no room for questioning, that the basement was completely off limits. She didn't want me going down there for any reason, no matter what. It was strange, the way she said it, like there was something in the darkness under that house she was guarding, something she didn't want anyone else to see. Nighttime came, and I went to bed early. This was before smartphones were a thing, so I had no idea what time it actually was. If I had to guess, it was probably around 9 or 10 o'clock, the kind of heavy, silent hour when the darkness feels thicker and the air in old houses feels colder. For the first few hours, everything was quiet, peaceful even, but I couldn't fall asleep, no matter how hard I tried. The bed was the most uncomfortable thing I had ever laid on, the thin mattress digging into my back, every spring poking at me like a reminder that I was in a place that didn't feel like it wanted me there. It felt like hours had passed, the darkness around me pressing in, when I started to hear footsteps outside my room. Slow, deliberate steps on the creaky wooden floors, the sound unmistakable in the silence. It sounded like Mel passing by my door, her footsteps dragging slowly, carefully, as if she was trying not to make noise, but failing on those ancient floors. Maybe she was just going to the bathroom, I told myself, trying to calm the way my pulse quickened as I lay there, listening. A few minutes later, I heard the footsteps again, the same slow, dragging creaks coming back down the hallway. But this time, they stopped, right outside my door. I sat up in bed, holding my breath, straining to hear. The darkness in the room felt heavier now, thicker, like it was waiting with me. I could hear the creaks, tiny shifts of pressure on the old wood, the sound of someone standing there on the other side of the door, waiting, listening. It was starting to creep me out, the silence pressing in so hard it felt like it might crack. Finally, the footsteps started again, slow and heavy, moving away from my door. I heard them go down the stairs, each step groaning under the weight, until I heard the faint, distant sound of a door opening downstairs, and then closing. A cold feeling settled in my chest as I lay there, staring into the darkness, the thought I didn't want to have forming anyway. The basement. It was a while later when I heard the door open again, the faint sound of it clicking shut, followed by heavy, deliberate footsteps coming back up the creaky stairs, each one slow and dragging. They came back down the hallway, back to my door, and then they stopped. I sat up again, clutching the thin blanket around me, straining to hear, the silence so thick I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. There was a shift in the floor, a small creak of weight shifting just outside my door, as if whoever was standing there was leaning closer. And then I heard it. The soft, metallic click of the doorknob starting to turn. I laid back down, pulling the thin, scratchy sheets over me, forcing my breathing to slow as I pretended to be asleep. I heard the door creak open, the sound slicing through the darkness like a cold blade, and then the soft shuffle of footsteps on the floor. They were slow, deliberate steps moving into the room, stopping just inside. I could feel her there, standing in the darkness, watching me. Mel. There was a long, heavy pause, the air thick, pressing against my chest as I lay completely still, barely daring to breathe. Then I heard the footsteps again, turning, leaving the room. The door closed softly behind her as she went back to her room. And then silence. But I couldn't shake the feeling, the heaviness of what had just happened. It was bizarre, unsettling, in a way that made the room feel colder, smaller, like the shadows were pushing in from the corners. I waited, letting the minutes crawl by, counting in my head until I was sure at least half an hour had passed. That was when I decided I needed to see what was in that basement. Carefully, I pushed the sheets away and slid out of the rickety bed, the frame creaking softly beneath me as I moved. I tiptoed to the door, pausing with my hand on the knob, listening, making sure the hallway was silent before slowly opening it. I crept down the hallway, each step on the old floorboards sending out tiny groans that felt impossibly loud in the silence, until I reached the stairs. I tiptoed down as quietly as I could, the darkness around me feeling thick and watchful. At the bottom, I stood in front of the heavy basement door, the cold air leaking from underneath it, brushing against my bare ankles. I swallowed hard, then slowly opened the door, the hinges letting out a low, drawn-out squeal that made me wince. I flipped on the lights, the bulb flickering for a moment before flooding the basement with a harsh, pale glow, and I began to creep down the stairs. Each step felt like it took forever, the air growing colder with every inch I descended, the smell of damp and rot getting stronger. I reached the bottom step and froze, clutching the railing, my breath caught in my throat, my body refusing to move. I had to hold back a scream. In the dead center of the basement, under the harsh light, were two old wooden chairs. Sitting in those chairs were two figures, slumped, lifeless. Two corpses. They were decaying, their skin gray and sunken, stretched tight over bone, their jaws slack, empty eye sockets staring at nothing. Wigs had been placed on their heads, dark, stringy hair hanging over their hollow faces. A bug crawled lazily across the hand of one of them, disappearing into a dark gap in the skin, and my stomach twisted violently, bile burning at the back of my throat as I clamped a hand over my mouth. Despite the nausea, the terror, the desperate urge to run, I forced myself to move, to step deeper into the basement, closer to the corpses. I needed to see if they were real. I needed to know. Both of the corpses had men's wigs on, hair stiff and dusty, as if someone had carefully placed them there. The larger of the two wore a beret, crooked on its head, the fabric stained and rotting just like the body beneath it. I don't know much about corpses or how quickly they decay, but looking at them, the way the flesh clung in thin patches to bone, the way the clothes hung off their frames, I would guess they had been there for almost a year. I felt like my heart stopped for a moment when I heard it. Footsteps, coming from upstairs, from the first floor, slow and heavy, muffled through the floorboards above me. I didn't have time to make it to the light switch. There was no time for anything. My mind screamed at me to move, to hide, to do anything. I ducked down, pressing myself behind one of the old couches in the basement, curling in on myself, my hands clamped over my mouth to keep the panicked, ragged breathing from giving me away. The footsteps came closer, slow, deliberate, each step groaning on the old wooden stairs as they descended, one creaky stair at a time, echoing in the cold, heavy air of the basement. I could hear the blood pounding in my ears, my breath coming in short, shaking bursts as I stared at the dusty floor, praying she wouldn't see me. Then I heard her. A whisper, sharp and soft all at once, cutting through the silence. My name. I risked a glance, just for a second, peering around the edge of the couch, and I saw her. Mel. She was already halfway across the basement, moving toward me with surprising speed.
a big kitchen knife glinting in her hand under the harsh basement light, her eyes locked on me. I knew she wouldn't be fast enough to catch me if I moved now. So I ran. I bolted from behind the couch, feet pounding against the concrete floor as I made for the stairs. Behind me, I heard her scream my name, her voice high and cracked with something that wasn't quite anger, wasn't quite fear, something worse.
She came after me as fast as she could, but I was already taking the steps, 2, 3 at a time, my hand clutching the railing as I pulled myself up, refusing to look back, refusing to see how close she might be. I made it to the first floor, my chest heaving, my legs screaming, but I didn't stop. I ran up the stairs to the bedroom I'd been staying in, grabbing my backpack with shaking hands, clutching it to my chest as I turned to leave. By the time I made it back downstairs, Mel was at the top of the basement steps, her eyes wild, the knife still clutched in her hand, her shoulders rising and falling with every breath. I didn't stop. I ran to the front door, flinging it open, the cold night air hitting me like a slap, and I ran to my car, fumbling with the keys, forcing them into the ignition with trembling hands. The engine roared to life, and I paused, just for a moment, trying to catch my breath, the adrenaline roaring in my veins. I looked up, and there she was. Mel, standing in the doorway of that big, dark house, the light behind her casting her shadow long across the porch, the knife still in her hand, her eyes fixed on me as I sat there. I didn't wait. I slammed the car into drive and tore down the long driveway, gravel crunching under the tires as I sped off the property, the trees blurring past me as I made it to the road, my heart still pounding like it might tear itself out of my chest. I made it home in 10 minutes, and that was it. Thankfully, I had never given Mel any of my personal information, no address, no phone number, nothing. She had no way to contact me again, and I intended to keep it that way. If I had to guess, I'd say one of those corpses down there belonged to her husband, the one she had mentioned only twice in passing, always with a strange look in her eyes. As for the other, smaller corpse, I have no idea who it was. But whoever it was, it didn't matter. It was a disturbing scene to witness. Something burned into my memory forever, a memory of something deeply wrong in that house, and something deeply off about that woman.